just want to start by saying how much I admire this book. You know, when I saw it was coming out before it was published last year, I was, you know, in terms of the subject matter, I was fascinated, of course, and I'm always kind of on the watch for stuff coming out of my home state of Alabama. And then I was like, wait a second, I don't really know this person who wrote this book. So who is this person? I want to get to know more about him, and I'm glad I've got to, and it's an honor to be here and talking with you. So I guess you know, I'm interested in starting with you know, as it said in your bio, you're not originally from Alabama, you're from Lancaster, PA, and I want to talk a little bit about how you came to this story, and then sort of how you approach the story as an outsider, you know, as someone not from the place you were writing about.
Yeah, it was fascinating. You know, I moved to Tuscaloosa, Roll Tide, in 2013 to go to the University of Alabama. And around that time in 2013, 2014, these were 50th anniversaries of major moments in the civil rights movement 50 years earlier. So, you know, the summer that I moved to Tuscaloosa is the anniversary of then Governor Wallace's infamous stand in the schoolhouse door, you know, the spectacle of him throwing the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny and refusing integration of the school. My first week of classes is the 50th anniversary of the bombing of 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham that took the lives of 4 little girls. And so I was really I felt like I was being invited to try and understand this new place through the lens of the civil rights movement. And so as I began working at the University of Alabama, sort of apprenticing as a writer, I start working with Chip Brantley and Andy Grace, and together we start working on the story that would become the first season of White Lies, the NPR podcast that we produced. And that revolves around another 50th anniversary that was coming up, that of Bloody Sunday in Selma, and 2 days later, the murder of the Reverend James Reeb, also in Selma. And so March 2015, the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, President Obama is in town to give a speech, and 40,000 other people show up. And Selma, you know, is a small city or sort of big town. It kind of straddles that divide. And so 40,000 people in town overwhelm it. And I'm there partly just because I've been on this journey, sort of combing through the legacy of the movement, making connections to the day, to the present day. You remember, this is the you know, early years of the movement for Black Lives. The Voting Rights Act had just been gutted by the Supreme Court. And so I was there partly, you know, we're starting work on this podcast, but also just to sort of bear witness to this moment, because it had been such an important lens through which I was really understanding Alabama and the South more generally. But what happened to me that day sort of insisted, like, whoa. If you want to even begin to grapple with the South and its history, you're going to have to go back another 100 years. You're going to have to go back to the Civil War. And that happened because I pull into Selma. Parking, as you might imagine, is kind of a nightmare. But I'd come to know Selma a little bit by then. And I thought, oh, the cemetery. You know, Selma is one of those places with the old Southern cemeteries, the Spanish moss, the magnolias, the mausoleums, its own system of roads. And so I think, okay, I'll stash my car on one of those roads. Like, it's right by the bridge. I can walk down, listen to President Obama speak. And as soon as I pull in, I see these signs saying, Confederate Memorial Circle closed, no trespassing. And a bunch of people sort of milling around this section of the cemetery, scowling at my car. And I just couldn't resist. You know, it was like catnip for a reporter. So I kind of wander over and just very credulously, you know, walk up to this woman and say, you know, what are y'all doing here? Like, this is Bloody Sunday. Like, what, what's going on? And come to learn, this group calls themselves the Friends of Forest, and had spent really the better part of the last 2 decades fighting about their right to put up this statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest. And, you know, putting up a statue of Forrest, a slave trader, a Confederate general, the first Grand Wizard of the Klan, that's going to be provocative, to say the least, anywhere. To do it in Selma, a place that's so synonymous with the civil rights movement and the voting rights campaign, was just sort of compounded the insult. But they had actually put it up in October of 2000, the same week that the city had inaugurated its first Black mayor. And the statue going up had kicked off protests, city hall debates, this massive, massive fight in the city about, whether it was appropriate to honor Forrest in this way. And it was on city property at first too. Eventually the statue was moved out to the cemetery, but then it's stolen. But the theft only prompts more fighting about whether they could replace it or not, more protests, more marches. Protesters sort of shut down a city council meeting. Eventually it brings about a federal lawsuit. By the time that I meet them in 2015, the Friends of Forrest had just won that federal case, and we're going to put up another statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest in 2015. And they were there that day, in addition to, I think, kind of thumbing their nose at the civil rights anniversary happening. They were there sort of preparing the grounds. They were going to do a whole renovation of this Confederate circle along with the rededication of that statue. And the dissonance of that, Confederates on this major civil rights anniversary, it just raised all of these questions for me, as someone who's not a Civil War buff at all, just some basic questions like, who is Nathan Bedford Forrest? But then also, what does it mean to put up a Confederate statue in 2015? And what does it mean to do it in Selma? And so I start looking into it and come to find there are all of these monuments, schools, streets, a county, a city, named for Forrest all across the South. And so I start to look into this thinking it might make for a good essay. But then that summer, two things happen. One, they rededicate the statue. So Forrest is back in Selma. And then two, just a couple weeks after that unveiling, Dylann Roof murders 9 African Americans at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston. And part of the fallout from that is this massive referendum on Confederate symbols. It became clear after he was arrested that he had taken this sort of strange sightseeing tour across South Carolina, going to Civil War battlefields, Confederate monuments, slave memorials, almost to kind of steel himself for what he was about to do. So this referendum on Confederate monuments kicks off, and so I think, oh, okay, I'll start following these protests aimed at Forrest specifically because of this really strange encounter that I couldn't shake that had happened in Selma. And so that's what the book is. It's 4 cities, 4 monuments of Forrest, and 4 campaigns to try and take them down over the last several years. But it all really does revolve around Selma. Selma is, of course, one of those cities and is really the inciting incident for the book. And one of the reasons I'm so excited to talk to you, Caleb, is that, and I know you have a connection to Selma as well. You worked for the Selma Times-Journal, I think, which is a paper maybe second only to the New York Times in terms of articles that I've read now over the course of the past couple of years, just working the microfilm machine on the second floor of the public library in Selma. But so I wonder, Caleb, I'm curious about your approach too. I know place is so important to you, and I wonder, as a journalist, but also as a novelist, like how do you approach writing about place? Do you have processes for that?
I don't know if maybe I can verbalize them somewhat since you asked me, but when it comes to fiction, it's pretty intuitive. I don't have a strong sense of how I'm approaching a place or even a subject really up front. I'm really just compelled by some idea or image or location, or question. And then I'm just sort of feeling my way through that, through multiple drafts of fiction until I kind of have a stronger understanding of where these questions are leading me and sort of why I'm so compelled to ask them. So it's a much longer process for me. And like I said, much more intuitive. I think with nonfiction, with journalism in particular, there's just a lot more preparation that from an ethical standpoint, it's just got to be done up front, with research and sort of understanding a place and kind of having some context that you don't go in and, possibly do harm in some ways, even before you've written the thing. And that's something I really learned on the job at the Selma Times. You know, it was my first job after graduating as an undergrad from the University of Alabama. It was really just by happenstance that I got it. An editor at another small paper visited our journalism class and said, "Hey, my friend at the Selma Times is looking for a general assignment reporter. You know, you should apply." And I did, and then I went down and interviewed, and then that was kind of it. I got the job and went. You know, it was the recession, and I was just grateful to have a job anywhere, and hadn't kind of thought too much about what it would mean to report and live and write in Selma. You know, I mean, I knew, as being an Alabamian, a lot of the history and sort of what Selma represented to people in the state and outside it, but I wasn't fully prepared for what it would mean to kind of live and work there in numerous ways we can talk about. But that's kind of what I want to get at for you in this book. And I guess the podcast too, since they seem kind of connected in ways. What was it like for you to report and write about Selma and to spend so much time there? You know, what were some challenges that we might not think of that you faced? What were some, you know, fascinating and interesting things about reporting in, like you called it, a big little town like Selma? So I'm interested in your experience that too, with that kind of the challenges and the benefits to working and writing about a place like Selma.
Yeah, I mean, it was really an education in how to report, and the degree of difficulty of reporting in Selma is really high. One of the things that I did early on that I think served me really well is that I got rid of my Pennsylvania number and got a 334. Got a 334 area code number, so that when I was calling people, and it was immediately more people started returning my calls. Not everyone. There were plenty of people who never return my calls, even with a 334 number.
That is a fantastic tip for any budding journalists that are tuned in. Like that's really, really smart.
Yeah. You know, insofar as you're able, just immerse yourself in the place, and you know, obviously there's no hiding the fact that I'm an outsider, but there, you know, being at least living in the place, I think got me a little bit of credibility. Being able to talk semi-coherently about Alabama football and Auburn football too, unfortunately, went a long way as well. But yeah, you know, I think part of what that area code realization pointed up was that folks in Selma are, and I understand why, they are so sensitive about talking about their history. I mean, it exists in the national consciousness as kind of synonymous with racial violence. I mean, partly celebrating the massive achievement, you know, the city that gave the world the vote, as it's sometimes known, but also, you know, especially among white Selmians, they're very defensive about talking about this stuff, and so here I come wanting to talk about its history, and specifically about this incredibly divisive figure, the most infamous person from the Civil War, but then this incredibly divisive figure from last year, a couple of years ago, amidst this referendum that was happening on Confederate monuments. They had been a sort of, in ways that they've been throughout its history, I think, in an interesting way, from, you know, taking on voter suppression to school segregation and to now Confederate monuments, the debate about Confederate monuments. Well, they had sort of been a sort of prologue to this more national battle that was to come. So folks are really defensive. One of the central figures of the story, this woman named Pat Godwin, who's the head of the United Daughters of the Confederacy in town, the woman that I met that first day in Selma at the Bloody Sunday anniversary, spent hours and hours and hours talking with more than I would care to admit, hours just talking to her on the phone about this stuff. And every time at the end of the phone call, making a plan to have an interview in person, and then she would cancel and reschedule, and we did that for probably a year. And then finally, as I'm driving to Selma one day, I get a text from her that says, you know what, I'm not going to talk to you. We feel like we want to keep our story. And I think there was really something to that they felt like this was their story. This was Nathan Bedford Forrest was theirs, and that any outsider, any interloper, certainly any northerner, didn't understand him, couldn't understand him, that he was this misunderstood figure, whose story they were going to tell, and they were going to tell alone. Um, what's interesting though too is that everyone was skeptical of me. I spent a lot of time trying to convince James Perkins Jr., Reverend Perkins, who was the first Black mayor of Selma, who was elected that same week that the statue first went up. And he ducked me for a long time, and finally we had, I was leaving my card in his door, talking to family members, really just finding any way in, again, an education in how to report, trying to find any way in, and finally I get him on the phone, and he's really skeptical of me. But over the course of our conversation, I come to find he was really interested in, I think he was skeptical of me because the story is such a spectacle, right? The first Black mayor of this town, synonymous with civil rights. The statue of the first Grand Wizard of the Klan goes up. It really sort of was spoiled what was and could have been even more of this moment of celebration, of redemption, when he was elected. I think he was skeptical of this white Northern journalist coming and wanting to talk about this moment that was incredibly traumatic, and upsetting, and so we had this conversation, and I think he was trying to get what I realized is that he was working to get this feel from me about whether that really the story wasn't just about him, but that the story was about me too, and that he wasn't going to talk to me unless I understood that. And that was really instructive. I think in some ways, this book, it's partly reporting, but it's also partly history, and it's personal too. And it was really the reporting process in Selma that taught me that I was going to have to find a way to be self-reflexive and really examine my own place in this story, because Perkins wasn't going to talk to me if I wasn't able to do that to really understand that I had a stake in this, that statue going up was about me, was about white Americans, as much as it was about the first Black mayor to get elected. And so that conversation was incredibly instructive and really guided a lot of the approach that I took in every city that I reported in, and really I ran parallel to a process that I was going throughout the past couple of years, and that I think is something a lot of white Americans have been doing recently. And it's one of the ways that I hope this book will resonate with folks, is really coming to understand the role that race, the role that the idea of whiteness and the sort of violent defense of white supremacy has in shaping our lives, even if we've been up to this point somewhat naive about that. And of course, that's the prerogative of that many Northerners take too. Like, the sort of received wisdom growing up in Pennsylvania is, okay, yes, it used to be a problem, but brave, noble people like Martin Luther King marched, and it was the idea of race in America was really a problem for them, and they stood up and bravely addressed it, and we sort of solved it. And insofar as it's still a problem, it doesn't have anything to do with me. Naive as it sounds to admit this, I think that I had really sort of absorbed that idea by osmosis. And it really wasn't until moving to Alabama and digging into the legacy of first the civil rights movement, and then the Civil War, and the legacy of slavery more specifically, that I really came to some discomforting notions of or realizations about how I was implicated in the story as well.
Did you have before you came down for grad school, right, in Alabama, and to study writing, did you were you doing journalism before? Did you have like a journalistic bent, or what was your writing and kind of interest before you came down and started kind of learning about Alabama through these anniversaries of the civil rights movement?
I was really interested in music. I wanted to be a music writer, and got really obsessed with samples in hip hop, and sort of went on a sort of reverse chronological deep dive into American music. Hunting down samples from songs, bringing me back to disco, to funk, to soul, to jazz, to blues, just tracing the history of 20th century Black music, basically. And I was lucky enough as an undergraduate to work with Kiese Laymon, who's an amazing writer and great on music specifically. And he's from Mississippi, and he sort of laughed at me, partly because in one of his classes he makes all the students rap, and I could never rap on beat. But he said, if you really want to understand this, you have to go to Mississippi. So as like a 20-year-old, I ride these buses down from the Northeast to Mississippi and kind of do a very kind of hackneyed, cliched tour of the Mississippi Delta. And realized how much more was there, that I was writing about the music, but it was alive in a different way there, and attached to all these different experiences and history and forces that I wasn't getting by just listening to the music. So I knew in kind of a clunky, inchoate way that I wanted to keep writing, and that I wanted to be in the South. I wanted, there's something, again, that I don't know that I could really articulate, but it was just a kind of feeling like something was happening there that I wanted to bear witness to, even if I couldn't say quite what. So I only applied to schools in the South. And when I got into Alabama, it was kind of a no-brainer. But not specifically really ideas about history or the civil rights history or Civil War history. That came by sheer coincidence. But now looking back, the old cliche about how you're writing the same thing over and over again. I think what I ended up doing with Monuments is what I was kind of doing with hip hop sampling, which is that here's this thing, but it points forward and backwards in all these ways, and there's all this history and references and people and ideas attached to it. And you see this one thing, a rap song, a statue in the courthouse square, but then you can sort of burrow into it. You can write into it and see all of the things through time that are attached to it, and kind of start to understand, it sounds sort of highfalutin to say this, but to come to understand the country a little bit better through doing so, and the ways that it's kind of this nexus of time and place. So there ended up being a kind of continuity to it, but only one that was visible to me in retrospect. I was just sort of reaching around in the dark for most of it.
At what point did you realize that you had a book on your hands? So I know you said earlier you thought, oh, this could be good material for an essay, right? But at a certain point, you spend enough time, you talk to enough people, you thought enough about forest and the monuments that you realize, no, the vessel that will hold this is a book. It's not an essay. Like at what point, do you remember a point when you were like, I think this is a book I've got on my hands?
Yeah, it was in the fall of 2015. So I was probably 6 months into work on what I thought was this essay about Selma and history and forest, when students at Middle Tennessee State University, where there's a monument, a building on campus named after forest, and inspired by the summer of protests, and specifically by Bree Newsom, who scaled the flagpole in Columbia, South Carolina, the state capital there, to remove the Confederate flag that had been flying there. Inspired by her, students at MTSU decided that they were going to begin this protest movement to try and get the school to change the name of Forest Hall. And one of the things that they did was the students organized this march across campus to Forest Hall, and they had made this paper mache body of Forrest, wearing a Klan hood and his Confederate general's coat, and had this strange sort of reburial of Forrest on the lawn of Forest Hall. And just the strangeness and the spectacle and the passion of that protest movement made me really think, okay, this is not just about Selma. There are people across the Alabama, Tennessee, whose stuff is happening in the moment, that it wouldn't just be a kind of retrospective historical essay, but there was stuff breaking on the ground that I could cover, and then use that as a way into this deeper history that I was starting to grapple with. So yeah, but what's interesting is that how many different versions of the book existed I had a draft of this book, or I was working towards a draft of this book in 2016 that was totally upended by the 2016 election. It had another draft of the book that was totally upended by Unite the Right, but then and there was stuff in the stories that I was covering that were changing dramatically in the aftermath of Unite the Right. So yeah, the story kept moving under the book as I was writing it. So I kept having, really, always new reporting, always new revisions to do as I was working on it. And we closed the book in early spring of 2020. So it was done. And then this massive uprising, this world historical, protest movement in the summer of 2020 happens. All of these monuments start toppling. And the book wasn't able to grapple with that. Now this summer, they've actually disinterred Forrest again and reburied him for a third time. He's now been buried in 3 centuries. So at some point it was just sort of like the book just sort of has to end, and maybe there's certainly more to write about it, but but yeah, it kept me on my toes, absolutely. First figuring out that it was a book, but then sort of trying to keep up with what that book could and should be.
Yeah, I'm glad you talked about that, because I certainly wanted to ask what that experience was like to be writing a book that was changing, and as close to real time as it can when you're working on kind of like the timeline of a book and book publishing. But I can't imagine. It seems like it was probably exciting and exhilarating, but also a bit frustrating and sort of, I don't know. For me, I maybe would have felt at times a bit discouraged, but you completely stuck with it seems. So, and I think I heard you say in an interview or read that you were sort of making changes or adding to the book, or kind of like considering current events up until the last possible moment when your editor was like, okay, no more.
Yeah, they really had to pry the book out of my hands. And this summer with the paperback, I was like, oh no. I'm gonna try I'm gonna try and gate crash Forrest's 3rd funeral. Like, can we hold, and maybe there can be more there. But the timeline was in flux for when that was happening, and it was like, no, the book is the book. How long is this going to be? How long do you need to do it? Is this 500 words? Is this 10,000 words? Like, the book is going to have to be the book at a certain point. And that was a little bit discouraging, but it's also one of the things for me is it was also a little bit reassuring too. I don't know what it's like for you, but I am a really slow writer. So the idea that I would do a kind of quick turnaround thing last summer that could grapple with these really important, and you talk about being ethical and not trying to do harm in your reporting. Like, could I produce something on a quick turnaround that was that could really contend with and speak to ethically and appropriately, these massive upheavals and a reckoning that was happening. And likewise this summer, this was just like 2 weeks ago. So it was really off the table. Book production calendars are strict. And so it was, not really conducive to me biting my knuckle and banging my head against the wall for a couple of months while I try to figure out how to do this justice. So at a certain point, it was liberating. It's like, the book is the book. It speaks to this moment in time, and it's a book. It's not a story online that you can update as things break, and just sort of say like, this speaks to a moment, and then there's more to write and more places to write it too. So I think I'm at peace with that, but there certainly were moments of, feeling like, oh, it's the book is out and it's immediately outdated. But I don't think that's true. I think that's just, the conflict between, breaking news and books.
Oh no, I certainly don't. And I didn't mean that by any means. I don't think it's outdated at all. And I think it's, it's a testament to kind of your diligence and sticking with the story, but also it is that the historical perspective, and it is the essaying you do in here too, that kind of gives the book a bit of timelessness. So it's not that maybe a straight piece of reporting wouldn't necessarily have. I want to jump back to this one idea. We were talking a little bit earlier about place, and this idea that you said, monuments aren't just like about the history they allege to represent, right? But about, who gets kind of what claims to a given place and how it's remembered or kind of interpreted. And I was thinking of this line from your book that I want to read and ask you about. And it's early in the prologue, I believe, where it appears. And you write, we mostly think about monuments in terms of their surface, who they represent and what they reflect. They are, after all, meant to honor and immortalize the person they depict, often by literally putting them on a pedestal. But the architect Aldo Rossi suggests that a city's monuments also serve as containers for the collective memory of that place, which I love that idea by the architect that you bring in that quote. And I want to just ask, like, at what point did you start seeing monuments in this, I guess, deeper way or more multifaceted way, other than just like they're a representation of this, like, when did you kind of start to see more connections being made, not just with the history, but the current moment and who's laying claims to the current moment of these monuments?
Yeah, I think again, like Selma just being so instructive. One, because you think, oh, that's a Civil War monument, that's about the 1860s, but you realize, no, that statue went up in 2000. So not, the Southern Poverty Law Center was their data journalism on this was really instructive, really laying out, across the board when these monuments are going up. And they're really sort of two spikes. One, the turn of the 20th century, late 1890s into the early 1900s, when this sort of the boom of Confederate monuments, which of course then aligns with and is speaking to and reflecting the rise of Jim Crow. As ex-Confederates are returning to power in the South and implementing Jim Crow, they're also hoisting these statues to their heroes. And then again, there's another blip more about place names and specifically school names that comes in the 1950s in the wake of Brown v. Board, as public schools anyway are integrating these what so-called academies, segregation academies, start popping up, in the South, bearing the names of Confederate generals. So again, they're tied to these moments. Yes, they're about the person that they seek to honor, but then they're also reflecting the period that they go up, but then sort of pulling them forward into the present as well. What's great about writing about what's super useful about writing about monuments is that they work this kind of intersection of person and place and move it through time, so that they're constantly keeping in mind in the public consciousness this historical figure. I mean, I know this. There's the statue of DeSoto that sits in the town square in your novel Treeborne, and sort of helps to infuse that book with that mythology of the conquistadors. And I think there's a way that Confederate monuments are doing that in a different way, of course, but are doing that as well. And Selma was super useful in that. This is about the past, but it's also clearly it's about the present, because you spent all this money and harnessed all of this political will to put up this statue of Forrest 150 years after the Battle of Selma ended and the Civil War ended. So it's speaking to the present as much as it seeks to commemorate the past, which is, again, as a writer interested in trying to figure out the ways that this past is shaping our present. Monuments are a terrific starting point for that.
Totally. As you're talking about that, it occurs to me just how the spikes in monuments and schools being named and resistance to integration of schools, it's disgusting and it's cruel. And also oftentimes these monuments and the spectacle around them, or even maybe just from an aesthetic standpoint themselves, are quite absurd in certain ways. And I'm thinking of particular ones, but I think that's something in conversations with friends and colleagues who are from outside the South and maybe haven't seen some of these monuments up close, or just sort of have like a less context for them. That's one thing I'm always talking to them about, is that, like, yes, they're vile, and this is like a reprehensible act to use these stone or letters on a schoolhouse as intimidation, but also if you get up close to some of these things and you look at them and you sort of are there in their space, they're absurd. They're clownish, you know, like
Yeah.
there's a lot of clownishness to them from an aesthetic standpoint that I always find kind of interesting and dumbfounding too.
Yeah, and it's hard not to resist sort of reading into that. You know, there's sort of, you know, the ugliness somehow, you know, representing the ugliness of the history that there's no good aesthetics. You know, so much of the sort of neo-Confederate paraphernalia is so kitschy. All the sort of paintings of Forrest are not particularly well done either. But yeah, no, you're right, and they're cheap too. I think, I can't remember where, I think maybe in Chapel Hill or Raleigh, protesters pulled down, this was a couple years ago now, protesters pulled down a statue and it just kind of buckled. You know, they threw a rope around it and it just sort of bent over as if it was made of aluminum or something. And of course,
some of these busts or some of these soldiers on Confederate memorials, they're mass produced, right? They're cast to produce as many of these as cheaply as possible, right? They're not singular or unique necessarily, all of them.
Yeah, exactly. Again, sort of giving lie to it, right? They're not this sort of natural, or, you know, one of the sort of bad faith defenses of these monuments is that they are the sort of natural, organic will of the people in this place seeking to honor this hero. God, there aren't scarecrows big enough from this place. But of course, like you say, they're mass produced. It was a propaganda machine that swung into gear, and there in the early 20th century. Yeah, and you're right, they are ugly. I have to talk about the statue in Nashville. That was,
well, that's the one on the top of my head when it comes to
yeah. I'm glad you teed that up. I would encourage folks, if you haven't seen this, to Google it at some point. But yeah, just this clownish plastic statue of Forrest that is I mean, it doesn't look like Forrest. It doesn't look like anyone. It looks like, you know, a weird one of those sort of darker 90s cartoons that were on Nickelodeon when I was growing up. Yeah, it's absurd, and you know, it was sculpted by this guy who was in his 90s. It was sort of his sort of swan song as an artist. I'm told, and I have it on good authority, I've seen some of it, that some of his other paintings and art are actually much better. But this statue of Forrest, that is, you pass it, I-65 North going into Nashville, you will see it on the right hand side. It's right on the road again. Right, this is not about honor and history. It's about being a troll, being provocative. You sit in traffic on your commute. You've got this statue of Forrest leering at you. But what was interesting about that too is that it's easy to get your jokes off on that, right? And you know, post Unite the Right, plenty of late night hosts you could crack jokes about that statue. But come to find, you know, the sculptor, the artist behind this man named Jack Kershaw, I mean, really, his life embodies the march of white supremacy and all its different incarnations through the 20th century. He marries Andrew Lytle's niece, Andrew Lytle, who's one of the agrarians at Vanderbilt, wrote a very fawning biography of Forrest as well. But coordinates the statewide resistance to school integration in the 50s. He's James Earl Ray's lawyer in the 1970s, man assassinated Martin Luther King, and then co-founds this group, the League of the South, in the 90s, in addition to sculpting this statue of Forrest. And the League of the South is responsible for kicking off a lot of the violence at Unite the Right in 2017. So there's this through line of basically a century of white supremacy embodied by this man. And his lasting work, at least in the public consciousness anyway, is this heinous, ugly statue of Forrest. And it's that kind of, that's one of the things though that was kind of difficult about writing this book though, is figuring out the right tone for talking about some of this stuff, because it is spectacle, it is ridiculous, it's full of bad faith arguments and these sort of ridiculous, you know, folks who want to stick up and defend Forrest and the lost cause, and to write about it in a way that is aware of that irony and you know, can grapple with the ridiculousness of it, while also being appropriate and respectful to the content of the book, which is filled with the moments of racial violence and exclusion and accumulation of wealth based on race. So it was tricky again, probably lucky that I had had all of these cracks at revising it to really hone the right way to write about this stuff that was multifaceted in both its ridiculousness and the ridiculousness of that we're still having this debate, while also making a good faith effort to insert some good history and reporting in it as well, and giving voice to so many noble and important activists who are doing the daily work of contending with these forces.
I think you do an excellent job of it, man. I really do. And I think it's a credit, coming from a journalism background myself, I know the only way you can sort of get that kind of nuance in a piece is through time and being on the ground and listening to people. And I can tell the many hours that you put in on that front, and just commend you for that, because it comes across on the page really, really admirably.
Thank you. I appreciate you saying that.
Patricia, is it time for questions now?
It is. Wonderful. It's that time. I'm unmuted, right? I've had one of those days where this morning I told somebody, I hope you have a good evening. It's not, so that's you're getting me. I'm going to get better, Connor and Caleb. I'm going to get better as this goes on. Last 15 minutes are going to be stellar. Right. So let me start off with some questions. Connor, when you're thinking about, and if I had to go and look at that monument that you were talking about, and I almost felt like I was that Mel Brooks needed to show up and do a skit, right? Because it looks as if that can't be serious, but yes, okay, it is. When you were on this journey, and one of the questions that came to mind were there moments where you thought it was too surreal, and how do you capture that in writing? How did you craft that almost trapped in an absurdist play sense?
I think some of it is on the sentence level, just trying to be a little bit more wry, and in sort of steer the reader up to a joke without quite having to crack one. I mean, I partly there was this really, in my visit to this statue in Nashville, the man who owns the property is this man, William Doris, who had actually died recently and left his fortune to a dog, which gives you some sense of what this guy is like. But when I met him, he said, I'm 90 years old, I'm 80 years old, and 90% blind, and was wearing these big, driving glasses as we toured the property. And he had me do all of these really strange things. Like, clearly he knows this land that the statue sits on really well and is very familiar with the history of it. But was having me do these very strange things to try and get me to understand that there was a past to this land, and that he had access to and wanted me to have access to. So he was sort of asking me to lay down at certain points and get a sight line across the interstate to see where this battle had taken place, and to, supposedly see the field where all these Confederate soldiers had died, or showing me the ice house on the property that had been built by the men and women that his family had enslaved, and clearly, like, place is infused for him with the past, a past that he feels is really noble, and that if I could only see it, that I would somehow see forest differently. I would see the question of these monuments differently. But yeah, I wasn't seeing it, and the whole thing did feel really surreal, and it did feel like it was kind of this case study in, our filter bubbles, or the polarized nature of American politics, of American sense of the past, and what that past should mean to us in the present. And it was, so I felt like it held all of that, but it was also strange enough that I felt like I could just kind of describe it. I could just recount it, and that I would only get in the way of it. In some ways, I think the surrealness of some of those experiences just kind of spoke for themselves. And to their credit, I think a lot of I think a lot of the protesters, I think a lot of the folks attempting to get these statues down understood the absurdity and the surreality of what they were doing. So I mentioned this, the paper mache burial, but also, dressing up like the Klan and going to the dedication of one of these statues, singing and shutting down city council debates, or these sort of open forums that they had to debate the appropriateness of a campus building where a third of the student population is people of color, being named after a Grand Wizard of the Klan. So I think in some ways they knew that this was a bad faith argument, in that doing a sort of, well, you got to hear both sides. I think he's bad. Do you think he's good? What do we do? Was never going to get them anywhere. And so I think they really intentionally, really savvily created these kind of surreal spectacles as part of their protest to kind of make the point that, yes, we are trapped in this surreal world. And that is that's part of their point, that this is ridiculous and obscene, that we're still honoring a man like Forrest and having debates about whether it's okay to honor a man like Forrest,
Now, I don't know if you, Connor, or you, Caleb, have ever been to Stone Mountain, but I have been to Stone Mountain, and the largest bas relief in the world, right? And so I imagine with the writing of this book, Connor, you've had people asking you to weigh in on maybe what you think of other places. And I wonder if you have a hot take, if you have a position on Stone Mountain. I was shocked. I didn't know what I was going to see. And now when I look at the website for it, it's marketed as this family friendly, great, things for the kids, fun things for the kids. So what do you think of Stone Mountain? And Caleb, if you want to weigh in on that too, please.
Yeah, it's, on one of the first reporting trips that I did for this book, I forget where I was going. I think I was going to Murfreesboro, and was following a protest at Stone Mountain on Twitter. And it got pretty heated. I mean, not heated to the extent of things we've seen since, like Unite the Right, but really intense and threatening to turn violent confrontations with neo-Confederates and protesters. And I was sort of following on Twitter. I was the passenger in the car, so I wasn't doing this while I was driving. But we pull off for gas, and in the gas station, and somewhere outside of somewhere in northern Alabama, we pull out into this gas station, and there's a tent outside the gas station with all of this Confederate paraphernalia that I perused for a while, seeing if there's anything about Forrest, and there was a couple of shirts. And I go inside, and it was clear that the women working behind the counter knew the man out, maybe a boyfriend or a husband of the man working it, and kept sort of looking out the window and very nervous. They were sort of stress eating, like they went twice to the candy aisle to get more chocolate to eat, as they were sort of looking out at the man selling these, all of this Confederate stuff. So it's this moment that was sort of infused with the feeling like this really was a kind of, Confederate symbols were really this sort of third rail of American politics suddenly, and making everyone really nervous and sensitive. So I always think of that moment when I think about Stone Mountain, and sort of the surreality of reporting now. It's sort of taking place on phones and on social media, and also in person. But I mean, I think they should. There's a proposal to include to put a etching of Outcast next to Lee and Jackson, and but I don't know, that sort of recontextualization or added context feels kind of insufficient to me, to grapple with the wrongness of what that etching, sculpture, monument represents. I don't know, Caleb, what do you think?
I mean, I'm definitely pro more artistic representations of the hip hop group Outkast wherever they may appear. But yeah, I think I agree with, trying to recontextualize these things is not good enough, in most cases. And I don't know that I have much more to say than that, really.
Okay. Well, another question, Connor, in writing about the Fort Pillow massacre, if you could, for the audience, just to give us a little brief synopsis of what that is, you discuss a question: what country do you want to live in? And the question from the audience member is, can you talk a bit about your thinking at the time and now about that question?
Yeah. So the Fort Pillow massacre, it takes place in 1864, so it's towards the end of the war. And the important sort of historical context there is that in 1863, in addition, the Emancipation Proclamation, in addition to declaring all enslaved people in Confederate territory to be free, it also allows for, and this is from some serious lobbying from Frederick Douglass, to call for the enlistment of Black soldiers in the Union Army, and they really did add, a massive lift to the Union Army. And so, at Fort Pillow, spring of '64, there are two troops of what were called USCT, or United States Colored Troops, and a third Union. Union troop stationed there at Fort Pillow. It's north of Memphis, right on the Mississippi River, and they were not well provisioned, not particularly experienced in battle, and Forrest's cavalry are in the area restocking, and here decide to make a move on Fort Pillow, and pretty quickly have the fort surrounded, and Forrest sends word, surrender, or I won't be responsible for what my men will do, and they don't, and so then the troops don't surrender, and so they have a battle, and then as it's clear that they're being routed, the Black soldiers do start to surrender, but Forrest men kill them anyway, and the death toll is stark. They were most of the casualties from that were Black troops. It's a racial massacre. Forrest is accused of a war crime for it, and it's investigated by Congress, so he's never officially charged with a war crime. And Forrest, in his report on the battle, says the Mississippi River was run red with blood, and he said, let it be known that Black soldiers cannot cope with Southerners, although he didn't say Black soldiers. So yeah, I mean, there's some historiographical debates about the specifics of what happened, whether Forrest just didn't have control of his men, or whether he actually, as one Confederate reported, to have these soldiers shot down like dogs. But clearly, just the racial motivations of this before and after, and given Forrest's report on the battle, were clear, and just an atrocity, really. And just one more moment in Forrest's life of this vicious racial violence that he perpetrated. But you go there, I think it's a little bit different now than when I visited, but you go there now and it's a state park, and it's sort of treated in parts like just a place to have recreation, and in part just like another battlefield, when it is really the site of this racial massacre. They're the trail that takes you to the remaining fortifications where this happened are full of, like, oh, you're jogging, like, keep going, don't stop, at the mile marker, which is just, again, sort of surreal to think about. And so when I visited, it really did raise, because of course I'm there and I've been doing all this reading and I'm doing all this reporting and thinking about this, the legacy of this racial massacre. the dissonance of what it actually is like to be there felt like a sort of microcosm of what it's been like to be an American recently, which is there is, we tell ourselves this story about the past that casts American as heroic, this font of freedom and democracy that is sort of unimpeachable, the kind of American exceptionalism that exists as the sort of water that we swim in, or used to anyway. But we're getting more and more referendums and interventions into this, and having more stories being told, like For Pillow, like the 1619 Project, that are asking us to square up to the darker moments, the in our country's past, of racial violence, dispossession of the land and the genocide of Native people, the legacy of slavery and all of the forms that white supremacy took long after emancipation. And yet that is then being countered with banning critical race theory, banning the teaching of the 1619 Project in schools. And so it really does feel like there is this sort of bifurcated memory in America right now, that you either live in a country that is starting to, in clunky and in kind of awkward ways, but trying to square up to the darker aspects of our past, or a camp of Americans that is just refusing to admit that even exists, much less try and grapple with it or pursue policies that might remedy it. So yeah, I think that's what I was thinking about in that question of what country do you want to live in? Because I think, at least for me, when I started digging into this history and when I started tracing it into the present, I really did kind of come to feel like I didn't know the country that I lived in anymore. That I started to feel like I was living in a different country and seeing so many things differently, personally, but also more broadly. Everything from the schools that I went to and how they came to be, but also wider things like the racial wealth gap, and the legacy of all of this stuff that the Civil War was fought over, and continues to be with us. So, it's there. It's there to be grappled with, but some of us keep turning away from it.
So we're at the top of the hour, but I wanted to kind of wrap up with what the two of you are working on. Where are you in your work? And is it just way too premature, Connor, to say, what's next, or have some seeds been planted that you're looking at something? And Caleb, you as well.
Yeah, Caleb, I think you like me must be trying to figure out how you write with a young child in the house now. And I wonder if you have any insights or breakthroughs on that front.
I wish I did, man. I don't right now. Yeah, Connor and I both have. How old's your kid? My kid's a little over 9 months now.
She just turned 1 a couple weeks ago.
Okay, yeah. So both little ones.
Yeah.
We both teach. Both have young kids. Trying to write, it's a challenge for me. I'm always working on a novel project to some degree, and I am right now. It's very early on. It's mostly set in North Carolina, and it's about climate change. I don't know if I'm prepared to say much more than that, but yeah, when I can. I had a class that wound up not meeting today, and so I had an hour and 15 minutes of unexpected time. So I just shut the door in my office on campus and worked for an hour and 15 minutes. And that was fantastic.
Right, that's good.
Yeah. All right. I'm taking notes. Canceling class and writing. Yeah. I'm still trying to figure out life as a sleep deprived dad. And partly I'm still, 6 years on, I'm still chasing this forest story. Like I said, he was disinterred back in June, and I actually had this really startling moment where I stood at the foot of Forrest's empty grave with Van Turner, who appears in the book, and really sort of mastermind the removal of the Forrest statue in Memphis. But one of the sort of unforeseen knock-on effects of that statue coming down was that he and his wife were buried under that statue, and so they were disinterred as well and removed. And so just after those coffins came up, I didn't get to see that. I was barred from that. But standing at the empty grave, with this with Van Turner, this county commissioner and lawyer in the city, was really powerful. He's now been reburied out in Columbia, Tennessee, in a private event that took place a couple of weeks ago that I tried to gate crash, but was escorted out by security from. So yeah, I guess I'm working on something that tries to contend with the late breaking news of a man who died 150 years ago. But yeah, in addition to that, I'm trying to work up a novel right now that's sort of a multi-generational thing about families at the University of Alabama, which that already feels like saying too much, and I'm going to spoil it. But yeah, there's a sort of inchoate idea about SEC schools and families here that I'm trying to get my arms around.
Well, we're looking forward to you both bring yourselves back for those latest works. But I'm glad that we had a chance this evening to celebrate Down Along with That Devil's Bones. And congratulations, Connor. We appreciate your time. You and Caleb had a fantastic conversation. There's going to be a really loud truck that's going by. Sorry about that. Life in the suburbs in Asheville. But thank you. And for those of you who may have had to join us late, you can always use that link to YouTube. We appreciate your time. Stay safe out there, and congratulations on your debut here, Connor. Thanks for sharing your work with us and your thoughts. And Caleb, thanks for being here. Good luck, you two new dads. You can do it.
Thanks so much, Patricia. It's great to be with you. Thanks for doing this. And thanks, Caleb, for doing this. It's great to talk with you.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Thank y'all.